I worked with a tester of iron and cold brass on my tongue. The word reduced it to a single wrong note that trembled in my ribs. Fog curled around my feet before I knew my feet assisted. It pulled at the joints of the organ pipes, like slow brewing regret. For a breathless minute I only lay still and catalogued the impossibilities. Cathedral height pipes that loomed like cathedral tower in a space that could not be adjusted, valves the size of doors, bellows that inhaled and exhaled with the patience of burial. The note lingered, a warped lullaby stretched thin, and it threaded a compulsion through me less like a pull and more like a summons. I did not remember arriving. Memory offered only the thin, irritated edge of things, a cracked wristwatch, a brass key on a leather tongue always warm from being carried, the sticky film of late-night regret, but no roll onto the cold bench, no explanation for how my collar had tasted of damp paper and organ oil. The fog tasted faintly of odor, tobacco and ink. It rose and slung between the pipes, carrying with it good strips of music that fluttered like moths between the bellows. Each bay bore a smear of handwriting not mine and fragments of sentences that might once have been apologies. The space felt wrong in a way that made my bones ache, angles and what had been like memory or the pressure. Light was a rumor here, till sand feel light softened by film grain hazy, red rim accents throwing up the suggestion of blood and rust. Chiaroscuro carved by rim lighting that stole the edges from faces. The organ breathed, the bellows heavy against my wrist with that note, and with every exhale the air seemed to push memories into my mouth. Compulsion tightened. The bench hummed me as if my weight completed some circuit. I rosy, hands still tingling, and the music threaded me forward. The islets between the pipes were narrow and wet with condensation. Drips fell with metronomic indifference, and each splash sounded like a page being turned. I moved slow because speed felt indulgent, and because speed would make whatever came next crueler. Spectral sheet music drifted from the bellows. The edges glowed faintly, not with light but with accusation. I reached a hand out and a pen brushed my fingertips, the pepper cool and slippery. Scratched notations scrawled across it were half memory, half instruction, places I had loved and betrayed, lines I had left unsaid, apologies I had swallowed. The organ did not simply play music, it exhaled. A lullaby wrapped itself around the chamber in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Not a tune that belonged to any nursery, but one made of piecemeal intervals that matched the cadence of my own forbidden phrases. The melody put them to things I had kept hidden behind practicalities. Lateness, silence at the wrong times, a small theft of honesty that had felt like survival. The first admission it presented was trivial and precise, a sharp filament of shame, an apology I had not given years ago when it would have mattered less. The organ's voice turned the memory into a scene that played without my consent, a third-party witness narrating the exact contour of my cowardice. The more I walked, the more the music tightened around me like straps. The bellows twisted against my sternum in time with some pulse that felt less mine than the chambers. Its inhalation of the organ drew the air from me and exhaled a memory in exchange. Faces unfurled from the fog, not the full selves but the moments where I had erred. The look I had avoided, the check I had not cashed the right way, the letter I had tucked away. They were not accusatory in a blunt way. They were surgical. The melodies were specific instruments of recall, harmonics, keto good. A simple phrase of 3 notes unspooled the scene of a petty betrayal under fluorescent light. Another chord progression unfurled the test of copper from a friendship he had let corrode. By the time I found the organ console, the music had become a narrator with a vocabulary of bone. The console was enormous and absurdly intimate at once. Racks of weathered keys, stops the size of clenched fists, a rusted lever marked with a faint impression the size of me small brass key. The bench sat like a confessor-esque seat, polished dark bass, centuries of hands. A melody unspooled that forced me to relive a small, shameful betrayal not as a memory but as a revelation. Its details rearranged as retold by someone who had watched me accrue excuses. The music did not ask questions. It cleared space in me so that answers, unwarmed by my own voice, spilled out into the acoustic. I could not close my eyes against it. Closing them only sharpened the sense that I was being unstitched. Pressure built like tide water. The bellows seemed to press at my chest, not metaphorically, but with the mechanical insistence of muscles. Breath quickened as more pages drifted free and the music threaded them together into a mosaic of confessions. Apologies and exhaustion blurred until I could no longer tell whether it was reading other people's handwriting or the handwriting of my life. Each melody prodded a seam I had learned to ignore. A minor sequence made my finger remember the exact coin I had dropped into a sidewalk rack rather than hand to a friend. A descending tritone forced the memory of leaving a door ajar and a dog escaping. The organ was a machine of moral pressure, an anvil on which my history was being hammered into a confessional tune. There was a presence moving in the shadows of the galleries, not quite human, an outline with the motion of a conductor, and the green of something meant to unsettle louder into a metronome. It kept time with a grin, where its head should have been. The silhouette suggested a conductor's baton and a clown's flourish at once. Its limbs were too long and articulated like clockwork. It kept a distance, observing the way the music extracted details from me, its timing precise. As if my shame had become a piece of theatre, and it were the stage manager. It drew my eye to a rusted lever near the console with imprint that matched the brass key carried. The key had always told myself it carried for practical reasons. The key sat in my pocket like a secret weight. Choice revealed itself in the form of a lever. Pulling it promised silence or at least a change, leaving it with permission for the organ to unspool deeper things. The present in the shadow watched with an anatomically impossible patience. Somewhere in the chamber, a laugh bubbled up, thin, distorted, and it had the rhythm of someone counting time out loud. My fingers found the small brass key in my pocket as if acting on years of muscle memory. And the metal was cold and familiar and absolutely ordinary in a room that had already made everything else unearthly. The lever rasped turning, the mechanism complaining like an old throat. The organ responded by deepening its pulse like a thing annoyed at being disturbed. When I seized the lever, the organ did not quiet. Instead, it delivered final melody that felt like a verdict. It came in layers. A low rumble in the pipes that made me mole ashy. A melody overlaid with walls of children's music that warped into something precise and cruel. And a counterpoint of voices that shouted like confessions he had not yet formulated. In that sequence, it presented the deepest secret as they held at by actor committed in a grey urgency years prior, an omission he had justified until writer's inconvenience made it true. The organ laid bare the particulars. The way my hands had fumbled the exact phrase of excuse I had offered myself. The way the world had folded away so I would not have to bear the thing it needed me to bear. The music showed me the timeline of my cowardice until the rationalizations were threadbare and no longer supportive. The loving claw as widened in the periphery as if it were testing the revelation. It fed Reinate as if the organ had siphoned blood from me and replaced it with clarity that stung. Rationality collapsed like a stage set. The structures he had built to keep shame tidy buckled the pressure of hearing the deed played back with excruciating cinematic detail. No words came from my mouth. The organ read them for me, shaped them into melody, and forced me to attend. For a moment I was simply an audience for my own undoing. When the final phrase dissolved into a single sustained tone, silence fell, not peace, but a silence like a held breath. The bellows stilled, the pages of sheet music settled in the air like dust motes, and for an instant I believed the worst was over. My hands trembled on the rusted lever. The bank creaked as he slid away from it, and the chamber felt too large for the shape of me, the vault swallowing up the edges of my shame. He pocketed the small brass key, feeling the metal bite the skin of my palm as if to remind me of the fact of it. The literal smallness of the object that had fit into a mechanism that could unmake me. It did not leave quickly. I moved to the isles with the sort of reverent slowness that good enforces, every step careful as if some additional revelation might be trodden by haste. The fog thinned toward the edges of the room, but no horizon resolved. There was always more air and more pie. Spectral music pages drifted a let fall at my feet without reading. Is it not one to be attempted? The glowing silhouette receded into the upper galleries, saving its green for wherever it captured things. The bank behind me hummed faintly like a memory. Zone, where it bled in, was color of chan film through a cracked lens, and for a moment the carnival's colors looked almost domestic into sadness. Outside the organ chamber, the carnival isle was empty and washed with the teals on. An abandoned organ bag sat with one leg slightly askew as if someone had risen without saying goodbye. A single stained sheet of music fluttered in a draft, and its edges suggested notation that he recognized it now as the map of my misdeeds. He picked it up out of habit and let it slip through my fingers. The loving glance later, when it came, was distant and considerate, not cruel exactly, but like an inevitable weather pattern passing through. It did not promise absolution, it promised recurrence. He kept the brass key. The watch on my wrist still had a hairline fracture across its glass and a hand smear across its face where late nights had become excuses. I walked away with the small things that would betray me later. The smell of pipe tobacco at my coat collar, the damp organ oil in my pockets, a new knowledge that the music would come again. The organ had not meted out a tidy punishment nor granted deliverance. It had turned my buried confession into a spectacle and left me standing in the middle of it, accountable now in ways I could not bargain with. The first step beyond the entryway felt oddly audacious. I did not feel lighter. I felt necessary in an unflattering way, as if now that my name had been sung in the correct scale, I had thought life into the sound. The fog remained at the threshold like breath held between teeth. I moved through it and did not look back. The loving glance clockwork green tracked me as if it were measuring me departure, the metronome of its amusement keeping a time I could not unhear. Silence, when it comes after confession, is not a bomb. It is a form of patience, a quiet sits and waits for the consequences to arrive. I knew then the organ not been a one-time urge, but an instrument of compulsion. There would be more melodies. The bellows had only inhaled. I had a small brass key, souvenir of my encounter, and the promise that choice remained. I wrapped my scarf tighter against the dam and the zone, the teal cyan light painting mooded crimson along its fringe, and walked away with my pockets full of sound. The carnival dissolved behind me into fog, and the silhouette of a Ferris wheel that refused to remain fully seen. I carried with me the knowledge that Ceylon was now an arrangement of notes it could no longer afford to believe in. The music had given back its confession like currency. I had to spend them somehow. The loving cloud at lateral rode the wind as I left, thin and private, and I felt it accompany me like a pledge that the next night would sound a new measure of truth. The nightmare had not ended, it had been recorded. So I keep walking, aware that the organ could begin again in any place that keeps secrets. The key is small and will rattle in my pocket when I run. The music sits like a bruise behind my sternum, an edge that is not a wound but a ledger. I tuck the bent silver lighter in me caught without thinking and find it colder than before. When no one is looking, I press my fingers to the thin scale on my jaw as if the skin might offer a map back to something salvageable. There is no need absolution, only the slow, necessary work of reckoning the sound the instrument forced from me. I keep the watch on my wrist because time will ask its own question and because letting go of it would look to me like surrender. At the edge of whatever town this place stitched to, the fog thins and the light becomes a little more ordinary. People will pass with faces that do not carry major progressions. I will intersect with them in the muffled way one passes strangers, each of us carrying our own little mechanism of noise. The organ taught me that confessions can be mechanical, Tadatun kan ka lies I fe into moments sharp enough to quote. It taught me that silence is fragile and that the act of naming is not always mercy. The lowking clown with metronomic ring keeps time for those lessons. I do not know how to stop the Calliope from calling again. I only know how to keep the small brass key with me and that. In the quiet hours, the memory, the final melody will play like a record. I cannot stop. I will wake in strange places and find myself listening for the bellows. I will sometimes put my hand on my mouth and test metal and recall the exact pitch of the note that began it all. That knowledge will be cumbersome and useful in equal measure. There is no closure here, only a ledger with a page turning and another waiting. The carnival recedes, but the sound remains, a ribbon of confession he must wear. The laughter follows like a shadow with teeth. It will not let me be entirely free. And when night finds me again, when fog crawls like an old habit around my feet, and the world goes thin at the edges, I will not pretend I am unafraid. I will only listen, because that is all I can do, and because the not listening seems like another theft of the truth of the work away. The organ taught me that the smallest thing become the heaviest when you do not name them. It taught me that music can be a reckoning and that the laziest of my rationales will be made into refrain. There is no tidy repentance in the notes. There is only the steady business of hearing and being heard, and acknowledge that someday, if I am allowed, perhaps it will learn to play a different melody. I walk further inside the instrument than I had any right to obey. The bellows around me breathed like lungs. Pipework rose like a cathedral, iron ribs glinting with patina of oil and old sorrow. Fog pulled in the concavities of the organs as wreaths and curled against my boots. There was a little heat where my hand pressed the brass key into my palm, familiarity as small as a bruise. The key's leather tongue had rubbed me skin the way a memory rubs a raw place until it smattered. And for a moment I could not tell which edge belonged to metal and which belonged to conscience. The opening of this leisure chamber arranged itself as a question in my hands. Who wrote Mason's down for the Calliope to read? The question was not loud. It was the precise second of quiet that renders the air, that pushes the rest of the world into a frame and excludes everything that is not the single point you must answer. The key fit between two pipes, like the last syllable of a sentence. The organ's hollow hunger turned toward me, and beneath the steady thrum of breath to reach, a faint accordion of nose wound, like a throat testing a shape. I cleave it because the organ does not invite, it requires. The cause also what hand logic suggested, a balcony of ivory and tarnished brass that spill into rows of annotated sheet music and ledger cards. Names lined the margins, each scroll a shorthand accusation. At first I catalogue mechanically. That's the tilt of a hand when writing a name, a shorthand note that read like a snapped photograph of a moment, left alone, stolen horror, a promise unmatched. But cataloging became accusation when the adjectives matched the shape of things he had hidden. The small taps of attention he had carefully expedient, the alloges he had swallowed whole. The ledger smelled of damp pepper and oil. It smelled like the scarves he had worn in other winters, like someone else's regret folded in with mine. I leafed through until the page resisted and then stilled, because the entries were arranged with a kind of intimate cruelty that makes a life legible. There were ledger cards with names he recognized only as silhouettes in the periphery of my past. There were names with deaths that fit too neatly into the pattern of outline he had cultivated. It scraped the surface of some earlier lie I had told myself. The forgetting of a face it would ease a conscience. The small betrayal disguised as survival. The organ did not simply replay, it annotated. Beneath the keyboards, concealed by a rusted flap, the key opened on a compartment whose hinge compliant like a throat clearing. Inside was a folded confession written in a hand my eyes recognized it before my mind could consent. My own cramped scroll, the letters leaning like they were trying to escape the sentence. The note played like a plate against my ribs. It described an event I had smoothed into a story in my head, Something I had told myself was an accident of timing, a wrong place at the wrong moment, and rewrote it as a deliberate compression of choice and consequence. The organ did not only slip memories into song, it collected their residue and turned it into ink. Recognition is an eruptive thing. It unfolded in me slowly at first, like a cold spreading from the fingertips. Then it gathered and rushed. A small theft of trust committed in a room that smelled of varnish and old lavender. A moment when preserving myself meant letting someone else see truth fall through my hands. Shame rose so fast it pressed it against me sternum. Panic came next, a practical, animal panic that sought a grasp but found only more sheets, more names. The ledger's a spine like a throat that would not slacken. The ledger was chronological and intimate. The entries read like a map of the ways he had narrowed my world to make it more bearable, a cartography of omissions. Each page implied a witness, and the ledger's witness was the organ itself, iron, bellows, reed. The music drifted through the loft like an annotation to the words. It pushed the letters into motion and made them live. A name on the page would bloom into a half-remembered afternoon. An accusation would resolve into a face at a window, small and betrayed. The organ did more than expose memory. It arranged it good into the scene and played them back until the sound had mass. Pressure grew behind the pipes, as if the instrument had noticed me inspection and tightened. The ledger stopped being an object and became a weight in the room. A gravity that meant choices would obey differently now. The pressure felt like hands pressing on me ribs, or like the chest tightening you get before tell someone the truth and cannot be undone. Flashes of decisions, petty, strategic, cruel in the economy, pressed at me. I felt them as weights, as the literal sensation of a bellows tightening and demanding release. I found a rusted lever labeled in fine stenciling. Admit. The word was simple and blunt, like a surgeon's instruction. The lever looked ordinary enough to be lethal. It had the candid utilitarian finality you find on machines that were designed to decide. The ledger lay open before me on a music stand, its worst entry exposed in ink that no longer wanted to be polite. The worst entry was not the most sensational crime I could imagine. It was the one small moral lapse he had buried and minimized, the quiet betrayal that had rotted a relationship at its root. Standing there, I felt the ledger's chronology close the loop on my rationalizations. The organ expected action. The pressure behind the pipes translated into compulsion. There was an insistence to the music now, a metronomic insistence like a heartbeat made mechanical, that elevated the ledger from mirror to judge. Each chord was a question. Each note pivoted toward a syllable that wanted to be released by admission. I was no longer just a listener. The instrument's architecture made me an actor. The lever was a hang between private omission and public consequence. The choice to pull the lever was both simple and terrible. My fingers curled around cold metal. For a breath, I considered concealment. To close the ledger and leave the compartment as if it had never been opened. To climb down and step back into a corridor that smelled of popcorn and distant, dishonest cheer. But concealment had been my craft. It had kept me comfortable and morally sedentary. The organ had catalogued the work of me inertia, and the ledger's accuracy made the math impossible to any. I pulled it. The movement was small. The sound it made was not. The lever came free with sign like a bell under steam. The organ took the admission and rearranged its pages with a mechanical, horrific grace. Ink shifted as if under water. Entries rewrote themselves entire script. Desks snapped into new order. It was not only the organ recording me admission altered the record, as tome confession were an editing tool that changed both the ledger and the confessor. There was light, a subtle rearrangement shadow along the pipes, and a note that sounded like a door locking in a language older than the one I spoke. After the lever's movement, there was the immediate aftershock, a feeling of both lightness and exposure that confounded expectation. In naming the thing I had done, I had not made it smaller. My chest felt both relieving and painfully raw, like a place that had been unstitched and was now tender with revelation. The ledger reconfigured. Where before there had been half-seen notes, There was now a clarity that made me unswerable in a way I had never been. Consequence rearranged itself in the quiet space after the music, and the organ's breath slowed, as if satisfied that the machine's function had been fulfilled. In the ledger's gutter I found a single ticket stub, the paper shockingly intact and embossed with a time and a symbol you recognized from the carnival entrance. The ticket smacked of inevitability. It read like an appointment. The organ's revelations were scheduled. This was not a random unearthing but a deliberate summons. The stub suggested machinery beyond the Calliope, an apparatus of judgment in which each instrument, each dry, kept its own time and made its own record. The stub was a mirror or a thread. There would be more sessions, more instruments, more ledgers. So I stayed because stepping away felt worse than the constant pressure of confession. I found myself cataloging the ledger as if its pages might take me out alive with the new shape of my memory. The organ's music continued to thrum under everything, and each melody put new confessions to the surface, not on my own, but strands of shared shame that threaded the carnival to its heart. The instrument's songs were lullabies with teeth. They soothed and then forced the mouth to open, a trick, absurdly, to measure the ledger like a scientist, counting entries, noting the cadence of music against the pages, watching the Calliope respond to its movement in breath and tone. The organ rewarded scrutiny with windows into the past I had not thought to open. Names that had seemed minor became evidence of a pattern, a small cultural avoidance I had participated in, not with malice but with the quickening of self-preservation. The ledger's chronology had a kind of anatomical cruelty. It showed how little acts accumulate into a structure that supports a life of omission. Ned lasted a long time in the organ loft. Inside the mirror-lined gallery adjacent to the pipes, my reflection came to feel like another page of the ledger, an image annotated with the margin notes of choices and excuses. The pressure behind the pipes became more physical as dawn diluted the fog with a cold, shine light. I felt like someone who had been disassembled and asked to stand in pieces while the machine recorded how each piece was felt. The organ's presence was not entirely punitive. It offered a form of verdict for conscience. Admission shifted what would be required to move forward. The ledger's aftershock taught me that some things are not erased by agreement. They are transmuted. Confession did not dissolve consequence, but it changed the calculation of it, opened new ways to be responsible. That realization did not redeem me. It complicated how I might lie with what I had done. When the carnival outside yawned and the first pale light sifted through the Ferris wheel's hollow skeleton, it took the ledger's ticket stub into my coat pocket. It warmed there, a small reminder that what I had done, to pull the lever and to accept the label of admit, had been witnessed by mechanism and by the instrument's peculiar jurisprudence, had been measured and catalogued. The system had marked me as part of its economy of truth. The organ did not stop there. A new entry on the ledger appeared as if written by the Calliope itself. Not a name this time, but a set of directions. It was less a command and more a scheduling, a ticket for tomorrow. The note suggested I would return. The ticket suggested the machine wanted more and perhaps deserved more of my honesty. I folded the confession and the stub into a pocket with hands that trembled slightly from the assertion of moral labor. Leaving the loft felt like stepping down from a pulpit. Each rung of the ladder moved me away from the organ's direct line of sight and back into the carnival's aisle where the smell of sweet thing tried to calate the austerity of what I had done. But the ledger's gravity stayed in me pocket and in the pit of my stomach. I did not feel absorbed. I felt altered. Outside the organ's shadow, the carnival still breathed its slow, practiced cheer. The Ferris wheel turned like a clock that had been watching me. My watch, the old brass thing with cracked glass, ticked with a sound that felt too honest for the place. I put my hand over it and felt the small, private rhythm of a life that was, irrevocably, now part of a public archive. The Calliope had offered me a letter in which my smallest sins were written as evidence. It had given me a lever with a simple word and a consequence that reached beyond the act. It had cataloged my entendement answer. I had answered. The ledger had changed it because of it, and because it had changed it, so had I. The carnival's laughter shifted in tone. It now sounded less like mockery and more like the machinery of notice. The logging clown kept time somewhere beyond the music, keeping watch over the pages as they turned. I do not know whether the organ wants punishment or remediation. Perhaps it wants both, or maybe it wants merely to measure. But I notice. The act of admission rearranged how the ledger told the truth about me. My confession was both a wound and a threat. It left me more exposed and, paradoxically, more tethered to the possibility of repair. Zone crashed fully and the teal fog thinned into a clarity. The ticket in my pocket was a scheduled thing. A promise that the Calliope ledger is not a one-off but a system. He kept the stop as a kind of contract. He kept the key too. Its leather tongue-threaded through a finger like a rosary of rust. The organ as bellows sighed, and the music reconsidered itself as if, for the moment, it had what it needed. My admission catalogued, my entry recorded, my place in its mark noted. I walked away from the loft slower than I had climbed. There were two lessons to carry. That confession just files and feeling, and that the ledger will keep counting. The carnival would not let me forget. The stop would be a summons, and somewhere, between the organ's breath and the Ferris wheel's slow rotation, the logging clown would keep time. I had pulled the lever and the machine had written its own. There was nothing left to but learn the arithmetic of consequence and return when the Calliope asked for me a coating. Yet even as descended, I held to the memory of the pages and a particular cruelty. I had expected the ledger to be a blunting, a logbook of misdeeds that would tally and therefore reduce me to a number. But what it was, in moments of quiet, felt more intimate than that. Its entries did not merely list, they narrated. The way the organ set memory to motion made me see how my omissions had been lived by authors. The missed calls, the half-offered sentences, the times he had looked away. Iglaninta ledger was a lens that refracted a life into smaller, sharper truths. It tried to recall the faces that had burrowed behind pen strokes. Some came back like splinters. A friend who had stood in a kitchen while I parried a confession with a jolt. A partner was a silence I had allowed to calcify into estrangement. A colleague whose credit I had let slide down the seam of a report. These were not the dramatic betrayals one finds in novels. They were the quieter modes of negligence that compounded, become cruelty. The organ made me see that cruelty sometime worse the rub of reason and comfort. I thought of the rust under the lever. How long it must have taken to corrode that mechanism to the point where a human hand could set a law into motion. The machine had been built people who understood leverage both literal and moral. It kept records not as a historian might, but as an arbiter might. To judge, to prompt, to force continuity where there had been evasion. There was kind of expertise in the way the instrument folded confession into consequence, a craftsmanship in the terrible justice of its architecture. Between the organ and the ropes that cordoned off the carousel, the carnival hummed with 1,000 small economies of exchange. Tickets for thrills, secreted forgotten candy, favors swapped with the ease of those who have practiced the art of forgetting. I felt stitched into the economy now, uncontributed and annotated. The ticket in my pocket was less red than a ledger entry that had been turned into a summons. It forced a rhythm upon me. Returning would mean re-entering that rhythm, tacking on whatever calibration the organ required. That knowledge was neither wholly bleak nor tender. There was a strained relief in the ledger's frankness. To know the terms of accounting is to have up, however narrow, back toward repair. The organ did not absolve. It offered a method. If the world outside the loft continued to prefer silence and the soft fiction of non-knowledge, the organ insisted otherwise. Its insistence was not necessarily moralizing, it was structural. It showed the cost of away numbers on a bank statement never could. By translating omission into sound and scene, I let myself imagine the next day, the future session the stop promised. I imagined returning with different kind of readiness, not a theatrical repentance, but a sustained willingness to inhabit the leisure's logic. Perhaps that readiness would mean small daily acts, a phone call returned on time, an apology offered. I woke to a note that felt less like sound and more like an accusation. It threaded through my ribs and set the small hairs at the base of my skull to trembling, a sustained pitch that answered to the rhythm of my pulse. Around me the organ had and exhaled with ancient lungs, bellows groaning like something waking after a long sleep. Fog pulled in the low places the chamber and clung to the soles of my shoes. When I pushed my hand through the vapor I found paper, a single page, brittle and yellow-wet, half-folded and wedged between two pipe seams. My name had been scrawled across the margin in a hand I thought not to recognize, the strokes familiar with the intimacy of regret. The organ was cathedral-sized, a monstrous architecture of brass pipes and wound leather. Up close the pipes were not smooth metal but rigid like the backs of sleeping insects. They seemed soldered in a craftsmanship that had once been proud and has long since acquired a quiet cruelty. Between them, the bellows breathed in a cadence that matched the note, and the note matched me asked if it had been made to fit into its cavity. I moved along narrow catwalks and felt the board flex beneath me weird. Each board complained softly underfoot as if the machine disliked being disturbed. Every step was accompanied by distant metallic creaks, the susurrus of 100 vows deciding whether to let memory through. Pages fluttered in the corridors between pipes like the wings of trapped moths. When I plucked one it resisted and surrendered, revealing notes that were not merely notations but sentences, phrases inked into staff line that Dreadline memory translated into sound. At first the scores were small things, a day when I had chosen work over presence, a keenness withheld until the moment it would have mattered. The margins were annotated with shorthand, the kind of private notations one makes to avoid looking at something fully. They arrived not as clear recollection but as pressure at the sternum, an imageless remembering that translated into the wicket of a pebble where a name should be. The bellows pressed in time and the organ answered with lullaby motifs twisted into minor keys, familiar yet wrong. Like a chills tune played on an instrument tuned by a mind that had learned treachery. Each melody nudged aside a shudder in me skull, and I felt the thin edge of anger, the wetness of remorse, the zoology of what I had convinced myself was survival. I told myself the music made me imagine things. I told myself the leisure of pages was a trick of light and film grain. But when I ran fingers over staff where a sequence of notes acted like an accusation. The melody rose and I was pulled into what it had been changed to name. Memory arrived as a pressure, the room falling in and compressing into the moment the tune described it. It was never wholly cinematic. The organ did not allegedly provide backstage lighting or moral commentary, but what it offered was precise. A focus on the smallest contours of culpability. A span of seconds bloomed. My hand on a curtain I should have drawn back, the choice of an easier phrase where honesty would have made me clumsy and human. The softening of my voice to spare my ego at someone else's expense. A moment cruelty that had been small enough to slide past judgment now expanded to occupy the center of my chest. The organ did not merely remain. It replayed with a combative fidelity that left me gasping. In that reply I tasted the metallic tang of a deception rehearsed on my tongue and felt the cool, unintended cruelty of a decision I had never properly seen. I found the ledger beneath a hatch in the console, a pocket hidden behind tarnished brass panel where the maker mark had been filed away. It was the kind of concealment that suggested deliberate work, an instrument made to hide what revealed it. The book was the size of a palm and smelled of oil and old music, its binding creaked when opened, and just rose from its pages like breath. Names were written in a succession down by a page, dates and thin notes that read like surgical records. Each name corresponded to a motif. As it traced it, my stomach twisted. One entry carried a that tore at me because it matched the night I had climbed Tobe elsewhere, the alibi I had told myself in the mirror. Another entry bore the name of someone I had left behind without a goodbye. A person whose absence I had rationalized it into an attitude that dissipated on the surface but never settled inside. The ledger condenses the geometry of my evasion into a ledger of witness. Where I had thought silence an act of mercy, the book called it a witness list. The more I read, the more the Gans operation felt like an interrogator that preferred music, tar rhetoric. The bellows tightened, and air became a hand closing around my ribs. It was an almost tactile compulsion. Sound pressed into me until it landed like a coin in the palm of memory. The mechanical insistence of the bellows had a rhythm that matched certain late nights I had spent avoiding the phone, the evenings I had chosen ease over courage, the dozens of half-promises that accumulated into an architectural absence. Pressure behaved like a narrative event. It shaped what I could think and where my attention landed. One breath and I was a region I had never crossed with another's, clear muffled in the review. Another breath and I stood beside a bedside lamp where I had preferred sleep to presence. The Calliope's music had become a lever that pulled the past into the present with a physicality that blurred the line between memory and wound. Those early revelations felt like rubbing away of varnish, thin filaments of truth appearing where I had once applied gloss. But the organs did not stop at surface blemishes. When I touched a page annotated with a hurried scroll, the melody it birthed detonated into a sequence of images dense and granular as sand trapped in a throat. I relived the precise angle of jaw, the small tremor of a voice when I chose to speak around the truth. I could feel the texture of a dinner napkin I had unfolded and refolded while avoiding conversation. The clumsy punctuation of lover he had offered to end an awkward silence. The organ traced those evasions with clinical patience, each motive naming a mode of avoidance. The light to spare feelings that were not mine to rearrange, the silent kept because speaking might require me to shrink or change. I felt the action of the person I had filed as if it were a bruise on my own ribs. Good week in life had been a diffuse fog, now condensed into shapes I could name. The music spoke of things I had sought pedaled for myself, terms I had arranged into plausible justifications. The organ stripped those constructions away with the clinical patience of a machine was a sultry was confession. At midnight the ledger's architecture revealed itself with a kind of cruel elegance. Names paired with death and a short notation that read like a title card for each piece. The Fogan lay, the quiet unsaid, the horror stayed home. These were not mawkish headings but precise identifiers, economy and language to mark the economy of my followers. I flipped to a page and found a name was present, collapsed the rational scaffolding I built. It was a name I had not thought of in years, a person whose existence I had deemed to preserve my comfort. Seeing the entry was like finding an old photograph with a corner burned away. The damage made the subject more real, not less. I remembered the color of their quad, the way they had hesitated on the threshold, their expectation that I would make room. The ledger made the correlation explicit. Some seen consequence, there was no ambiguity in the linkage. The music, the organ, they were parts a single machine designed not to punish inspector but to convert avoidance into accountability. The bellows pressure built until the chamber itself fly along about to collapse, breath shortened. The pipes roared and tenquated with the cruel punctuality of judge tapping a gavel. The air grew warm and the leather of the bellows tightened as if the instrument preparing to compress into a single, unavoidable conclusion. I tried to step back from the console. My legs obeyed, but the catwalk seemed longer than it had when I approached. The world narrowed the distance between my hand and a rusted lever, the metal cold and somehow expectant. The ledger's last annotation before the final set of names was stark, full orange. Choose the language of confession or the language of silence. The organ's demand was not rhetorical. When I stood before the lever, I felt the weight of choice as a physical pressure rather than a moral concept. possibly concentrated into a small resistive object. On the one hand, pulling would admit the truth and unsettle whatever semblance of order is arranged in the corners of me life. On the other, wrenching the machine might silence the music forever, but at the cost of burying names not only in the organ but in me, deeper than before. Each option carried its own violence. The need exposed violence of confession that would rip open things and force reckoning. The covert violence of silence that would compress names into scar tissue. The lever's metal was cold, but the air around it vibrated with heat from the bellows. It sweated under my core and tasted the oily tang of the organ as it gnats on my tongue. For a long time it simply held the lever and let the bellows talk in pulses, as if hoping the rhythm might translate into morality and tell me what was all. The choice he made was not clean. Is it not yank and slam the mechanism into oblivion, nor did I pull with the ceremonious clarity of confession. It moved like someone deciding which limb to sacrifice. My fingers closed and acted, and the organ answered in a way that uttered what silence would mean thereafter. The sound that resulted was not a single note but a cascade, a torrent of motifs unraveling at once until the whole chamber seemed filled with a chorus of apologies. They were not mere apologies into these sentences, but the tenor of regret made audible. The stutter of a withheld truth, the hollow of a promised visit that never came, the dull metallic ring of a trust mislaid. The music laid them out one after another, unsparing in cadence and detail. It drew all shames I had sworn to myself to keep from being diminished, petty cruelties that had become habits, and presented them in a relentless litany. Hearing them together was own form of asceticism. Where once my conscience had been a dim traffic light blinking sporadically, the organ organized my lapses into a continuous beam I could not ignore. Each motif provided context to the next. The way he had deflected at a funeral, the omission at an anniversary, the excuse offered when he should have listened. The sound mapped the topography of negligence. I felt them as blow as bond simultaneously. The pressure that had bruised my chest unspooled into space like rope loosened from a wound. They were released in the naming even as there was pain. The music did not absolve me, but it kept me honest in a way that embarrassment alone never could. When the Calliope released, the organ did not collapse into immediate silence. Instead it offered a different kind of quiet, the hush for things that have been said and to scan by catalogue, weighed, and moved through. A single stained sheet was the artifact left in my hand, damp with bellows oil and bearing notice that trembled like breath on paper. The letter's last line had promised consequence. Consequence had arrived not as punishment but as an altered topology of the possible. In the aftermath, my heartbeat was steadier and also more honest in its rhythms. The world around me was the same in its objects but altered in meaning. A bench now a small field of decisions, a light blue eye that had got me as I looked away. The organ had not held anything outside me. It had only remade the geometry by which I measured myself. I left the organ chamber with a watch that chimed like a memory and a brass key warm against my palm. The console slice went up behind me in a series of clicks, and the bellows settled into a final exhale that sounded suspiciously like laughter, not but knowing. The corridor to the outside opened into an abandoned carnival isle that smelled of dust and old sugar. Sun-bleached posters hung at odd angles. Cotton candy stands were racks of color. A ferry wheel silhouette etched across a toxic ski. The midway was a reliquary of half-joys, chip paint fences, rusted horses frozen mid-gallop. A ticket booth whose glass had cracked like an old smile. Zone approached like an interrogation lamp. A pale light that softened the edges of things without forgiving them. On the isle, the silence hummed. A quiet that carried a residue of melody, as if the Calliope's influence had leached into the wood and metal of the midway. I walked with the key in my hand and felt that I had been altered in ways that would not lead themselves into absolution. The organ as silent was temporary, I understood, a sleep that might be resumed. The ledger's names remained, recorded in a book that could one day be opened again, and the stained page in my palm kept its ink like a map of wounds. The brass of the key warmed against me skin because of the heat of the choice he had just made. In the distance, the loving clown kept time, more a metronome than a tormentor, its presence a punctuation more than a sentence. It did not move toward me with malice, but observed it with the intimate patience of something that had watched people learn to bear themselves. Its painted green fossilized into an expression that had seen too many confessions. It reached the edge of the carnival where salted dawn met an indifferent horizon. The bank by the gate was empty, and a single sheet of music fluttered across the pavement like a bird with one wing. I paused and watched it spin, recognizing in its movement the ambivalence of action and inaction. Each alternative yearned for a different pace of life, the slow, careful steps of making amends, the quicker, coward retreat into forgetfulness. The brass key felt heavier because it was both a tool and a reminder that the work of confession was ongoing. To hold the key was neither absolution nor damnation. It was the simple fact of responsibility, a small iron truth I could carry with me. There would be no clean closure, only the weight of decisions and the music that would remind me when I tried to forget. When I walked away, the carnival receded into the palette of me life the way bad weather recedes, visible, capable of returning, and forever altering how one reads the ski. Its shadow lengthened and tinted, but traces remained. A tune that might appear at odd times, an involuntary tightening at the thought of a missed birthday, the sudden memory of a conversation avoided, the silence that followed wet hummed with the fine echoes of the organ's melody and with a new, thin possibility that truth, once plucked into the open, changes how one breathes. It kept the stained sheet folded into me quite. It kept the key warm. It kept the knowledge that confession had not freed me of consequence, but had made consequence legible. Fog still lingered, and the loving clown's echo readied the quiet lie a question with no expected answer. The horizon remained pale and indifferent. The work ahead would be messy, often humiliating, sometimes impossible. There would be a conversation that would not go as one planned, admissions that would reopen old wounds rather than close them, apologies that might be refused or go unheard. But some machinery inside me had been set in motion. The Calliope read me private ledger aloud, and in so doing had given me a language for the things he had done. The reckoning would continue, and probably a long time. For now I step into the thin zone and let the key grow cold against my palm. I walked with that uneasy steadiness that follows a night of torment and decision, aware of the silence that hummed and the possibility that the organ would play again. The brass in my hand was a token, not a trophy. This between me and the organ was a measure of the work still left to do. The carnival-esque shadow lingered on my shoulders as I went, and I carried the knowledge that the Calliope music could always find me if I allowed it to. I also carried the recognition that choice shapes the sound of what follows. The ledger had named me, the lever had answered. The notes were still warm under my skin, and I would not sleep as if oblivion could undo what I had heard. The path forward neither silence nor surrender, but the slow arithmetic